CEO dared the black janitor. Play Chopin, and you'll marry my daughter. What happened next was unbelievable. Comment below from which city you're watching, and hit the subscribe button for more videos. The chandelier light caught the ivory keys of the grand piano, throwing shadows across the silent banquet hall. Guests leaned forward in their velvet chairs, champagne flutes frozen mid-air, as if the whole world had paused to watch. At the center of it all stood Mr. Alistair Veyron, a CEO whose fortune was whispered about in every business journal. Known for his ruthless negotiations and eccentric challenges, he loved nothing more than testing the men who came near his only daughter. Tonight, his game was crueler than ever. With a thin smile curling on his lips, he turned to the young man standing awkwardly by the piano. Julian Carter was no suitor in a tailored suit, no polished aristocrat. He was the night janitor, hired to mop marble floors and empty crystal ashtrays after the parties ended. His uniform was plain, his hands calloused, his presence invisible. Until, "Now play Chopin," Alistair said, his voice smooth and cutting. "Play it flawlessly, and I'll consider you worthy of my daughter's hand." A ripple of laughter passed through the gilded hall. To them, it was absurd. A janitor at a piano before a crowd of billionaires? Impossible. Some smirked, others whispered. His daughter, Celeste Veyron, sat frozen beside her father, her pale face betraying both shock and a secret hope she dared not voice. Julian stepped closer to the piano. His eyes flicked briefly toward Celeste. Eyes that held no greed, no calculation, only a quiet fire. The weight of the CEO's challenge pressed down on him, but so did something else. The memory of nights spent cleaning while melodies haunted, his mind of an old upright piano in a forgotten church where he once taught himself notes by ear, long before life crushed him into silence. The crowd expected humiliation. They expected him to stumble, to stammer, to fail and retreat into the shadows where men like him belonged. But Julien didn't move toward the bench right away. Instead, he spoke, his voice steady, carrying more strength than his uniform, suggested. "Chopin isn't a trick to impress the rich," he said. "It's a conversation between pain and beauty. If you really want me to play, I'll play it. But not for you, sir. For her." His words sliced through the hall like a bow across strings. Celeste's eyes widened, her hands trembling in her lap. The crowd erupted, gasps, chuckles, outraged whispers. Alistair's smile tightened, but he leaned back in his chair, intrigued. Then, "Play," he said coldly. "Let's see if a janitor can carry the weight of Chopin." Julian's fingers hovered over the keys, the hush so complete that every heartbeat could be heard. What happened when his hands finally touched the piano would not only silence the room, it would unearth secrets, rewrite destinies, and shatter the game the CEO thought he was playing. By day, the Veyron empire gleamed. Hotels, art galleries, vineyards in France. Every piece of Alistair Veyron's empire was a polished jewel. But by night, the cracks showed. The Veyron estate, perched on the cliffs outside Geneva, was a palace masquerading as a home. Crystal chandeliers, marble staircases, golden railings, but little warmth. Servants moved quietly, never lingering. In hallways, guests came for galas, not for family dinners. In this frozen palace lived Celeste Veyron, Alistair's only daughter. At 24, she was beautiful, in a way that felt fragile, like porcelain placed on a shelf for display. She played the piano with technical precision, trained by Europe's most prestigious tutors. Yet, despite the flawless notes, her music always sounded empty, like a bird that had forgotten the sky. Her father's expectations pressed on her shoulders like iron weights. Alistair Veyron wasn't raising a daughter. He was grooming a legacy. Whoever married Celeste would inherit not just wealth, but the power to continue his empire. Suitors came from old money families, men in tuxedos with practiced charm. But Celeste remained detached, her smile polite but hollow. Beneath the surface, she longed for something her father couldn't understand: authenticity, real music, real love. Something that couldn't be bought or bargained. That's why Julian Carter's presence unsettled her so deeply. Julian wasn't supposed to exist in her world. He was a janitor, hired to sweep floors, mop marble and polish glass. He was 29, tall, with a quiet strength in his posture. His skin was dark, his uniform plain, his accent touched with the cadence of West Africa. He spoke little, and when he did, it was with careful thought. Most in the estate overlooked him. To them, he was invisible, a shadow moving at the edges of their glittering parties. But Celeste noticed. She noticed the way he lingered near the grand piano long after the room emptied, his hand brushing the polished surface as though it held a memory. She noticed how his eyes lit when he overheard a melody drifting from her practice room. And once, only once, she caught him alone, seated at that same piano, his fingers moving with a raw, untrained brilliance that made her chest ache. Chopin, broken in places, but alive in a way her own playing had never been. He hadn't seen her watching. He never knew she had heard. But her father noticed too. To Alistair, Julian was an irritation, not because of his work, but because he didn't behave like other servants. He didn't cower, he didn't rush to bow or flatter. He carried himself with dignity, and in the cold eyes of Alistair Veyron, that was arrogance. And worse, Celeste's gaze lingered on him. That was how the cruel dare was born. Alistair could not tolerate even the idea of his daughter admiring someone from outside their circle, especially not a black janitor. For a man like him, bloodlines and appearances mattered as much as fortunes. To humiliate Julian publicly, to crush him in front of Celeste, seemed the perfect solution. So, he staged the challenge, not in private, but during one of his glittering galas, before dozens of witnesses. The chandelier lights burned bright. The crowd of elites filled the hall with perfume, laughter, and wine. And Alistair, with his practiced smile, pointed at the janitor who had been quietly working in the corner. "Play Chopin," he declared, loud enough for every ear to hear. "Play it, and I'll let you marry my daughter." The crowd erupted in laughter. They saw it for what it was, a performance, a cruel spectacle to remind everyone of their place. But Alistair hadn't expected Julian to accept, and Celeste hadn't expected her own heart to pound at the thought that he might. Because Julian carried something no one in that hall could imagine, and when the first note fell, nothing would ever be the same. Julian lowered himself onto the piano bench, the murmur of the room swelling behind him like an ocean. The polished wood felt cold beneath his fingers, as though the instrument itself doubted his touch. From across the hall, Alistair Veyron reclined in his velvet chair, fingers steepled, a thin smirk carved into his face. His eyes gleamed with satisfaction. He had staged this moment like a master conductor arranging a crescendo. This wasn't about music. It was about humiliation. The guests leaned forward, their jeweled necks shimmering in the chandelier light. Their whispers cut like knives. A janitor. Does he even know what Chopin is? This will be amusing. Julian's hands hovered above the keys. His heart pounded, but not from fear of failure. Fear he knew well. It had followed him across oceans. What he felt now was something else. The unbearable weight of being seen, truly seen, for the first time. He closed his eyes, searching the dark for the sound that had once carried him through childhood nights in a cramped apartment, through the loneliness of immigrant work, through every insult that had reduced him to the help. He thought of his mother, her humming in the kitchen, her voice strong despite a life of burdens. He thought of the broken upright piano in the church basement, the first place he learned that pressing ivory could summon not just sound, but solace. And then, he pressed the first note. It rang out clear, startling in its purity. The laughter faltered. The crowd leaned in. Chopin's nocturne began, faltering for a heartbeat, then surging with unexpected life. Julian's fingers moved with raw, unpolished brilliance. He did not play like a man trained in Parisian conservatories. He played like a man who had lived every note. The sorrow, the struggle, the fragile beauty, they poured from him, making the marble walls tremble. Celeste's eyes filled with tears. She had heard his secret once before, late at night when no one was watching. But hearing him now, unflinching under the cruel spotlight, was different. He wasn't just playing music. He was defying every sneer, every whispered prejudice that had tried to reduce him. Alistair's smirk faded. The crowd shifted uneasily. They wanted to mock him, but the music silenced their tongues. Some looked away, uncomfortable at being moved by someone they considered beneath them. Others stared in disbelief, caught in the spell. Julian reached the climax of the piece. His body swayed, his soul pressed into every key. And then, suddenly, he stopped. His hands froze mid-air. A gasp rippled through the hall. He looked up, directly, at Alistair. "This music isn't a game," Julian said, his voice steady, echoing in the hushed hall. "You asked me to prove myself. I don't need to. Chopin doesn't belong to the rich. It belongs to anyone who carries sorrow. Anyone who dares to turn it into beauty." The silence was suffocating. The air vibrated with tension. And then, one person clapped, Celeste. Her delicate hands came together, trembling but resolute. The sound cracked the silence like thunder. Slowly, hesitantly, others joined. A few polite claps at first, then a swell of applause, until the hall erupted. But not everyone applauded. In the back, a voice hissed, "Parlor tricks! Anyone can bang on keys, he doesn't belong here!" The words sliced through the applause, poisoning it. The faces in the crowd hardened again, masks of superiority snapping back into place. And just like that, Julian's triumph teetered on the edge of collapse. Alistair rose to his feet, towering above the whole. He raised a hand and the applause died instantly. His voice rang cold. "Impressive. For a janitor. But let's not mistake passion for mastery. My daughter deserves more than theatrics." Celeste's chair screeched back as she stood, her voice breaking for the first time in public defiance. "No, Father. She deserves truth, and you just heard it." The hall gasped. No one ever spoke back to Alistair Veyron. Julian's chest tightened. He hadn't expected her to defend him. He hadn't expected her voice to cut like that. Sharp, trembling, but filled with something dangerously close to rebellion. Alistair's jaw clenched. For a heartbeat, father and daughter locked eyes, and in that silence hung something heavier than music. The threat of war. Julian's victory was fragile, suspended by a thread. Because in that room of wealth and power, applause meant nothing. Only Alistair's will decided who belonged and who would be destroyed, and he was not finished with Julian yet. The applause had died. The hall smelled of perfume, wine, and something sharper, tension, like iron in the air. Julian sat at the piano, shoulders taut, sweat clinging to his temples. He had played Chopin. He had spoken truth. He had made them listen. And yet, the victory felt hollow. Alistair Veyron stood at the edge of the dais, towering like a judge at trial. His voice carried a blade's edge. Pretty words. A performance, yes. But anyone can learn tricks. He gestured toward the piano with contempt. A monkey can dance if trained long enough. But this... His hand swept across the glittering hall, the chandeliers, the gowns, the sharp stares. "This is a world you will never belong to." Murmurs rippled, affirmations from those too cowardly to speak louder. The mask of civility cracked, and prejudice spilled raw. Julian rose from the bench, his chest burning. "I never asked to belong," he said, "only to be heard." Gasps again. His voice was calm, but it carried through marble and glass. Alistair's eyes narrowed. "Then you'll be heard. One last time." He snapped his fingers. A servant wheeled out a second piano, smaller, older, its wood scarred and dull. The crowd laughed in confusion. Alistair turned to Celeste. "Since you defend him, let him prove himself against you." The air shifted. Celeste's face paled. "You play Chopin, my daughter plays Chopin. If he matches her, if he equals what I've invested years and fortunes to craft, then perhaps I'll admit he has a place." His lip curled. "But if he fails, he walks out tonight, forever." It was a duel. Not of fists, but of music. A spectacle, cruel and gleaming. Celeste trembled. She had played Chopin 100 times under tutors' eyes, but never like this. Never. Against someone whose life hung on the notes. Her gaze met Julian's, pleading. She didn't want to be part of the humiliation, yet her father's command shackled her. The crowd leaned forward, hungry for blood disguised as culture. Julian sat again, his hands hovering over the keys. Celeste sat at the other piano, her fingers delicate, pale against the ivory. Alistair lifted his hand like a conductor. "Play," Celeste began. Her notes were flawless, each phrase sculpted by training. It was precise, exact, cold. Applause followed every section, the elite nodding in approval. Then it was Julian's turn. He closed his eyes. He thought of his mother's humming, of working 3 jobs to survive, of nights cleaning this very hall while others dined under chandeliers. And when he pressed the keys, he didn't just play Chopin. He poured his story into the music. Every insult, every dream, every wound. The notes were imperfect, rough in places, but they lived. The hall grew restless. Some leaned in, visibly moved. Others scoffed, unwilling to admit the janitor's music touched them more than Celeste's. Perfection. Celeste stopped playing, her hands trembling. She looked at him, not as a rival, but as someone who carried what she could not. She whispered, barely audible, "It's not about winning, it's about truth." Julian's hands stilled. He let the last chord hang, vibrating in the marble silence. The room erupted, applause and protests colliding. Some clapped wildly, tears in their eyes. Others shouted, "Trickery! Sentiment! Not mastery!" Alistair slammed his hand on the table. The hall froze. "He is dismissed," he barked. "This spectacle is over." Julian straightened. His eyes locked with Alistair's. For the first time, he did not see a titan of industry. He saw a man terrified of losing control. "No," Julian said quietly. "This is just beginning." A hush fell. He turned to Celeste. "You've lived, in silence too. Not the kind without words, but without choice." Her breath caught. The crowd stared. Alistair's face reddened with rage. Julian faced them all, his voice ringing. "You think music belongs to bloodlines, to wealth, but Chopin wrote for the broken, for exiles, for those who had nothing but their soul to give. That is who I am. That is what I've played. And you cannot take that from me." Celeste rose, her voice trembling but clear. "Nor from me." For the first time, she stood not as Alistair's daughter, but as her own. She moved to Julian's side, her gown brushing marble, and laid her hand on his. The hall gasped. Alistair's empire trembled, not in stocks or fortunes, but in the unthinkable defiance of a daughter choosing love, choosing truth, over his command. His voice cracked with fury. "If you walk with him now, you walk away from me forever." Celeste's eyes filled with tears. She looked at Julian, at the crowd. Then slowly, she turned back to her father. "I'd rather walk in music than live forever in silence." The words struck like a chord struck too hard, vibrating to every corner of the room. The silence that followed was not polite. It was raw, stunned, irreversible. And in that silence, Julian knew the battle was not won, but the war had begun. The chandeliers still trembled from the weight of silence. The room had witnessed something it was never meant to see. Not a concert, not a duel, but a rebellion. Celeste's hand in Julian's seemed small, but the act itself was enormous. Every pearl-wearing guest, every cigar-scented critic, every shareholder in Alistair Veyron's empire had seen the daughter of the most powerful CEO in Geneva take her stand. Not at her father's side, but beside the janitor he had tried to shame. Alistair's chest heaved, fury visible in every muscle. For a moment, he looked like a king watching his crown fall into fire. Then, with a clipped turn, he stormed from the hall. His polished shoes struck marble like gunshots until he vanished into the shadows. The crowd dissolved in chaos. Some shouted, "After him." Others surrounded Julian and Celeste, torn between fascination and disgust. Cameras flashed. Journalists who had been invited for the gala now had a scandal brighter than diamonds. Celeste held Julian's hand tighter. "It's begun," she whispered, her voice trembling. He nodded. "Then let it begin." By morning, the story had devoured every headline. CEO's daughter defies father for janitor pianist. From mop to maestro, the man who challenged. The Veyrons, love, music, and a family torn apart by pride. Talk shows dissected it. Critics scoffed, saying Julian's performance was raw but undisciplined. Others swore they had never heard such honesty in music. For Julian, the days that followed were a blur of both hate and hope. He was no longer invisible, but visibility came at a cost. Some spat at him on the streets, calling him names that burned worse than silence ever had. Others sent letters, thanking him for daring to stand where he wasn't supposed to. Conservatories that once ignored him now debated his name in their halls, and Celeste had severed herself from her father's empire. Accounts frozen, invitations withdrawn, 1,000 luxuries vanished overnight. For the first time in her life, she woke in a bare apartment without servants or staff. She was free and frightened and alive. Julian cleaned offices by night still, though now strangers sometimes lingered to hear him play the piano tucked into a corner of the cafe where he worked weekends. Each note carried more than melody, it carried defiance. Alistair Veyron was not a man who lost battles quietly. He used his influence to blackball Julian from every concert hall. Untrained, undisciplined, a danger to culture, the reviews read. When small clubs tried to book him, pressure mounted until contracts were torn. But Alistair underestimated the one thing he could not silence: the people. Clips of Julian's performance spread online, raw recordings from phones. Hidden in the audience, millions watched, millions wept. What the elites dismissed as sentiment became a symphony for the world's forgotten voices. He was no longer just a janitor. He was a symbol. Months passed. Julian and Celeste built something small but real. They held music sessions in parks, under bridges, in community centers where children who had been told they'd never belong touched pianos for the first time. At first, the gatherings were small, 10, 20 people. But word spread. Soon, hundreds came. They didn't come for polished perfection. They came for truth. And truth was louder than chandeliers. Even critics who once mocked him began to bend. "There is something here we cannot ignore," one admitted in print. Finally, an invitation came. Not from Geneva, not from Paris, but from Warsaw, the birthplace of Chopin. A festival that celebrated his music wanted Julian to play, not because of lineage, not because of wealth, but because his performance had reminded people of what Chopin meant: exile, longing, and the fire of those who had nothing but soul. On the night of the festival, Julian walked onto the stage of a hall larger than any he had cleaned. Celeste sat in the front row, her eyes shining with both pride and fear. Alistair was there too. He had come not to support, but to gloat should Julian falter. The lights dimmed. The hall hushed. Julian placed his hands on the piano. His heart thundered. Not from fear of failure, but from the weight of all those watching who had once been told they were less. He began. The music rose. Not flawless, not polished, but alive. It spoke of nights mopping marble floors, of years muted by prejudice, of a love that had risked everything to be true. When the final chord faded, there was silence, a silence deeper than rejection. Then applause, thundering, endless, like rain finally breaking drought. Celeste wept. The world listened, and Alistair. For the first time, Alistair lowered his gaze, not in defeat, but in something more dangerous. To a man like him. Realization. Julian did not become the richest pianist. He did not live in mansions or own companies, but he became something rarer, a voice. His concerts were never in gilded halls alone, but in schools, refugee shelters, and broken neighborhoods. His story traveled further than Alistair's empire ever had. He proved music was not about inheritance, it was about humanity. Celeste never returned to her father's mansion. She and Julian built a life that was fragile, humble, but honest. Their bond, born not of privilege but of defiance, endured. Alistair's name remained on skyscrapers, on companies, on magazines. But at every mention, there lingered the shadow of the night his daughter and a janitor had shattered his illusion of control. In the end, power was not lost in stocks or wealth. It was lost in a single choice: to cling to prejudice when the world demanded change. Racism, prejudice, and pride. They build walls of marble and glass, convincing us some are born worthy, while others must serve unseen. But music, truth, love, they do not bow to marble. Julian's story reminds us the world does not change when the powerful grant permission. It changes when the silenced refuse to stay silent. And in every hall, Every street, every life where courage dares to sing, silence is broken. Forever.